So affordable housing is a top priority for New York and increasingly other U.S. cities. But all too often it feels like we're losing ground. Mayor de Blasio has called for construction of 80,000 new units, and this is on top of 55,000 units of affordable housing built under Mayor Bloomberg. And most of these are high in quality. Some are really innovative, like Alex Gorland's Nehemiah Spring Creek in East New York, these row houses we see in the lower part of the slide, and Datner and Grimshaw's Villa Verde top in the South Bronx, which are, like many affordable housing complexes today, built really to a higher standard than a lot of market rate housing. So the trouble isn't with quality. The trouble is that the housing is rarely affordable enough, and there is too little of it. For every apartment that gets built, we have hundreds, sometimes thousands of families applying to live there. As historians of urban housing in the 20th century, and as Carol mentioned, Nick has, well, actually she didn't mention this, but Nick has worked extensively on the history of low-income public housing, and I've worked on middle-income housing. We thought it was important to put today's crisis in perspective by looking back at the city's long legacy of affordable housing, which you see represented in this map that we produced for the book. I know you can't really see what's going on, but afterwards you can take a look at a hard copy of the book and get a picture of what you're seeing here. These icons here are calling out the 30 or so case study projects we focus in on the book, and then we've color-coded different subsidy programs, so you get a sense of what was built and how over time. Green represent projects built by NYCHA, the city's public housing authority. Blue are Mitchell-Lama projects. Pink are middle-income rentals and co-ops financed by the Federal Housing Administration, which I'll talk about in a minute. Yellow is a whole mishmash of other programs that we consolidated together. Units built before 1973, when we see a sort of wholesale shift in housing programs. And then the black dots, the small black dots, represent projects built since 1973. And also, just as an underlayer, we shaded it in this lavender color everything that at least originally was covered under rent control or rent stabilization, just as a point of comparison. Although in the book, we don't talk a lot about those programs because they really fall outside of our focus on below market subsidized housing. Our goal in the book was to move beyond stereotypes about affordable housing as rundown, dysfunctional, and institutional to assess what New York has done right and occasionally wrong since the first public subsidies were introduced 90 years ago in 1926. And these are local and state subsidies, about 8 years before the first federal ones. And projects that we explore include middle-income ones like Springsteen and Goldhammer's amalgamated cooperative apartments in the Bronx up at the top, and Sir Jackson's Brutalist Eastwood on Roosevelt Island, developed under the auspices of the Urban Development Corporation in the 70s. Of course, they also include low-income public housing, like the modernistic Williamsburg houses in the black and white image opened in 1938, and post-war high-rise red brick complexes like Amsterdam houses, which we see in the color image. Ooh. Speaking of heat and humidity, right?
That's good. No, that one has fallen down like 5 times, and we thought we fixed it today.
Now, unlike a lot of writing about housing, we didn't just want to explore how the housing was designed or paid for, or the sort of political programs which underwrote it, but we were interested in exploring how it's bettered the city. So the book is really about these places as communities and the ways in which they've improved the lives of ordinary New Yorkers over the long haul. In the US, there tends to be a lot of research at the beginning and the end of housing, especially affordable housing. So we talk about design and construction, then we talk about demolition and failure. And I think Pruitt-Igoe is the sort of classic example of this dynamic. But much less has been written about what happens to complexes that endure decade after decade. Places like the Wrangell houses and Ravenswood houses on the left, which are low-income public housing complexes, or Queensview, a middle-income co-op shown on the right. And all of these complexes opened 65 years ago. They all opened in 1951. For the people who live in affordable housing, like this family at Stuyvesant Town, which they were photographed by the New York Times in the 1970s, as well as for city leaders, for building management, it's all about the many months and years, forging community, raising children, keeping things in good working order. And through their efforts, 1.5 million people now live in housing built as below market with government subsidies in New York, in conditions that are clearly better than what people could afford on the open market, and in neighborhoods transformed for the better by these efforts. So for the book, Nick and I each went back and revisited some complexes that we'd written about before and other research, but with this new agenda in mind of exploring the long-term lived experience of housing. More importantly, we managed to recruit about 30 of our colleagues from around town, around the country, to do the same. We'd be talking 10 years from now if we had attempted to do all of this ourselves, even given how quickly Nick researches and writes. We also invited architecture students at Nick School, NYIT, to build models. They built 10 models of representative complexes, such as this row house developed by the Nehemiah Housing Corporation in Brooklyn. And you can see all of these models both in the book and also in an exhibition. We've co-curated an exhibit at the Hunter East Harlem Gallery, open Tuesday through Saturdays from 12 to 5 through May 29th. And you can see many of a lot of the material from the book, but the models are really extraordinary. And they really help people who aren't great at reading plans, certainly the general public, understand more about what it's like to inhabit affordable housing. We also raised money to bring David Shalial, who's a photographer but also a sociologist, and he'd been exploring public housing and the destruction of public housing in Chicago, its replacement with mixed income communities under the Hope 6 program, and his work there really impressed us. And we got some money and invited him to come to New York to look at the projects that we were focusing in on the book. And many of the photos that I'm showing tonight are ones that, including this one, which was taken in in Melrose Commons in the South Bronx, are his photographs. So over the next, half hour, 40 minutes, depending how quickly we talk, we're going to give you an overview of the book, highlighting some of the key people, design concepts, and policies that have transformed the city over the past 90 years. And we hope this will convince you of the importance of below-market subsidized housing. Many of you are probably already convinced of that, so perhaps we're preaching to the choir, but it always bears repeating. So the story begins in the 19th century, in fact, long before the first government subsidies. And this is when reformers, following the lead of examples in Great Britain for the most part, began organizing nonprofits to build quality housing for the working class at below market rents, such as these which we see here. But progress was slow. There wasn't a whole lot of incentive to start these organizations and to build and operate this housing. By the 1910s, after about 40 years of work in this direction, some reformers began to articulate a bolder set of ideas, ones that we believe remain as true today as they were a century ago. First, that only government subsidies can make a real dent in the housing problem. Second, that government has a responsibility to house people at better conditions, at a better standard than the market can do. And third, that doing so is essential to the social and economic well-being of cities, especially big, congested, expensive cities like New York. With the support of trade unions, especially the Jewish Needle Trade Unions, in 1926, New York State passed the nation's first major law offering government subsidies for affordable housing, in this case in the form of tax abatements that cities could offer to qualifying projects. And it worked to a degree. Monthly costs at the amalgamated cooperative apartments, which I showed you before, which featured this incredible garden space and ample community facilities. The savings that was passed along to tenants averaged about $450 a month in contemporary dollars per apartment. Unfortunately, the apartments were still too expensive for the poor, and because the law offered no money for construction, there was little hope of closing this gap. Now, all this changed with the New Deal and the introduction of public housing. And Nick's going to talk about public housing in a minute. Actually, hold on first. While I have your attention, first I'm going to talk about a kind of lesser known but parallel system that also emerged in the 1930s in support of middle-income housing, which has been equally crucial to the life of a city like New York. When public housing was first discussed in the US, there were, I'm simplifying a little bit, but there were basically two competing visions. People who were coming out of the nonprofit housing sector, including architects like Clarence Stein and housing leaders from trade unions like the Amalgamated, fought for a system really patterned on European examples, Britain, Austria, Germany, in which government subsidized the construction of housing for a broad spectrum of the market, really a full third of the nation, maybe even the lower half of income earners. Some of this housing was built and owned by municipal governments. Some of it was built by nonprofit groups receiving government grants and then would be operated either on a rental basis or on a tenant-owned cooperative basis. And most of this was concentrated on cheaper suburban land at the edges of the built-up area of the city. There wasn't a whole lot of support for this in the US, not least because many developers claimed the system would undercut their business. Instead, Congress supported a competing plan, and this one was put forward mainly by reformers coming out of the settlement house movement. These were kind of urban activists working in poor neighborhoods in cities, and they were really dedicated to the idea of rebuilding existing neighborhoods with new housing, with much higher quality housing. And this plan enjoyed somewhat broader support, and it certainly proved less controversial and passed. But while lawmakers in Washington rejected the idea of using cash subsidies to build for a broad range of incomes, they did understand that, especially in a big, expensive city like New York, middle-income households did seem to need some kind of help in order to afford high-quality housing. So in 1935, the year-old Federal Housing Administration began supporting construction of nonprofit rentals and co-op apartments. And the program worked a bit like FHA's, the FHA programs that everybody here knows about, the small house program, in that it ensured loans for projects meeting certain basic architectural and urban design standards. But a key difference from the house program was that in the apartment program, units had to operate on a nonprofit basis or a low profit basis, with federal restrictions on rents and in the co-ops on resales to keep them out of the speculative marketplace and ensure long-term affordability. And by the 1960s, when the program began to fall out of favor, New York had seen about 80,000 units built under this program, more than anywhere else by far in the country. Architecturally, typical FHA complexes like Glen Oaks Village in Queens followed prototypes that had been established in the 1920s and early 30s by designers like Clarence Stein and Henry Wright, in part at Sunnyside Gardens, for those of you who are familiar with that complex, and more fully at places like Chatham Village, which had been built in the early 30s in Pittsburgh by a foundation on their designs. And the short of it is that units were arranged in multiple small 2 or 3 story buildings on spacious landscape superblock campuses. So not unlike the kind of social housing that had been done and was still being done in Europe. The program did also support construction of elevator buildings, maybe not quite skyscrapers, but certainly vertical buildings, including several projects in Manhattan, such as 1270 Fifth Avenue. Meanwhile, New Yorkers continued to pursue other avenues for housing for a group that came to be called the quote-unquote forgotten middle. These were families too well off to qualify for public housing, but who still, at least in an urban environment, couldn't afford high-quality market-rate housing. And these were families that the city increasingly feared would flee for the suburbs. As early as the late 30s, the city had begun courting private partners with deep pockets who were willing and able to build middle-income housing at a large scale. And chief among them were insurance companies like MetLife, which built Parkchester in the Bronx beginning around 1938. But to enable these companies to build in Manhattan, where the cost of land was so much higher, the state had to pass the 1942 Redevelopment Companies Act that allowed these private companies to benefit from eminent domain. Later, the city and state used the program to recruit other investors, producing projects like Queensview, a co-op in Long Island City with homes for more than 700 middle-income families, which helped to stabilize that neighborhood, which was suffering from deindustrialization. Another crucial partner in this period were trade unions. Robert Moses recruited Abraham Kazan from the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America to develop a large project at Corlear's Hook on the Lower East Side right after the war, and then in 1949 encouraged him to set up an organization called the United Housing Foundation that for decades would serve as a kind of large-scale developer of middle-income housing throughout the city. And UHF built 2 more complexes on the Lower East Side, and then went on to do Penn South in Chelsea, Rochdale Village and war-based houses in Brooklyn, and then eventually Co-op City in the Bronx. Neither the state nor FHA, though, offered long-term direct subsidies. And as more and more middle-class families were leaving for the suburbs, city leaders came to see this gap as a major problem. Again, fearing that the city was about to become home exclusively to the very poor and to the very rich. In the late 40s and early 50s, they tried again in Washington to get subsidies for middle-income housing in Congress, but again they failed. So they turned to the state, and in 1955 they succeeded in getting a law called Mitchell-Lama passed. And this law was written by Mayor Wagner's office, but it would, if you follow housing politics today, you know that we require the state's help to get most things done. So it was a law that had to go through the state legislature. And Mitchell-Lama worked by offering private and nonprofit builders long-term below-market interest rate loans. And it proved more prolific than FHA's program and financed more units, about 105,000 in the city before the program basically kind of went bankrupt in the 1970s, and at lower cost than the FHA complexes. And some were done on greenfield sites, helping to create new communities like UHF's Co-op City, which is today the largest majority-minority controlled complex in the country. And some were built in slum clearance areas or in other kind of rundown neighborhoods like Highbridge House in the South Bronx, which you see up top, which helped to stabilize those communities suffering from disinvestment. And all told, these various middle-income programs produced, by our estimates, about 270,000 units of housing between the mid-1930s, or really late 1930s, and the mid-1970s, which was enough to house about 10%, 1 in 10 families in the city by the time these programs either canceled or collapsed in the kind of economic stresses of the 1970s. So now I'm going to turn the floor over to Nick to talk about public housing.
Can you hear me all right? I'm going to use the mic if you don't mind. So thank you, Carol, for having both of us here. I'm delighted to present. And what Matt really to kind of... Okay, sorry. So what Matt has really, I think, effectively shown is the kind of public-private partnerships, which really built basically middle income, subsidized middle income housing in the city. So we're going to rewind a little bit, and we're going to talk about now the fully public dimension, which is known as the New York City Housing Authority, or public housing, which is not to say there has not always been a private dimension. It was private contractors who constructed the buildings. But in any case, just press this. All right. So rewind a little bit, back to the 1930s. Public housing basically emerges as a kind of works program, is in its justification nationally, but really was the answer to the dreams of housing reformers for a number of decades who really were looking for a way to clear the slums, create a modern city. And so they basically used their friend in Washington, a number of their friends, Senator Wagner, but also the President Roosevelt, a number of very powerful New Yorkers and a powerful congressional delegation, basically get a program through that they really wanted and they've been wishing for a long time, which basically provided deep subsidies for the construction of public housing, or publicly controlled and managed housing, and over time, subsidies, which came later in a larger way, subsidies for ongoing maintenance and so forth. So what was the vision of public housing in New York? It was, of course, the answer to the tenement slums, and for basically an income level which was, generally speaking, below what Matt was talking about. They're targeting levels at first, certainly a bit below the kind of middle income programs, but basically delivering a product to the working class of the city, again, which they could not afford or which developers would not construct for the working people of the city. So it was modern apartments, air, light, modern fixtures. You have to remember that in the 1930s, you've got a lot of apartments still in New York that lacked central heating. So there were individual stoves in apartments, there were cold water flats. So when you really look here, I mean, these are some of the first apartment interiors. They delivered light, air, but also modern amenities, for their time, modern kitchens. And that was a crucial difference between the tenements, which the reformers hoped to replace. And over time, in the course of the 1930s, which you can read about in more detail in a variety of books, or this particular book, and so forth on public housing, because of a kind of, I think, American sense of what is appropriate to basically spend on housing for poor people, the Housing Authority adjusted its methods. Its first housing developments were some of the best housing developments ever constructed in the United States, like Williamsburg houses you showed a picture of, Harlem River houses. They were walk-ups. They had nice courtyards. The finishes were very good for the apartments. But because of this there was enormous outcry over the quality which was being offered to poor people. And so over time, the Housing Authority adjusted, particularly when there was a federal program. The sort of formal federal program began in 1937. They began to basically reduce the standards of housing to a certain extent. They still provided the modern heating plants, the open spaces. This is Queensbridge houses. They still delivered kind of the same package, but definitely on a more simplified version. The buildings got higher. They were elevator buildings. They went towards elevator buildings. The finishes of the interiors were more simplified. The actual architecture was much more repetitive. There were no real details on the outsides. It became more what we're sort of familiar with in terms of public housing. And that model Queensbridge house is also extraordinarily large, very large, 3,100 units. Still the largest public housing development in the country. Some of the nice things sort of in New York, there is at the center of Queensbridge houses, there is a little shopping center. One of the other compromises was, even though most of the founders of public housing, including Mary Simkovich, who came out of the settlement house movement, wanted to really do center city redevelopment very early, they did compromise and build some of this early public housing in former industrial sites, where there wasn't a lot of shopping or things like neighborhood amenities. So in some of the first housing projects like Harlem River, you also see this at Queensbridge, you have a little shopping center at the center of it. And, when you kind of think about, this is Harlem River houses, when you kind of think about the first housing developments, today there's a lot of kind of criticism of the sort of sense of isolation, right? That these developments really don't, in many ways, relate that much to their neighborhood. But that was intentional. because they didn't like the neighborhoods then, right? The reformers were thinking, hey, you know, what was the neighborhood? It was a bunch of tenements and sort of all the things they hated, bars and, you know, things like that. So they were going to make this, this kind of new neighborhood, this new vision of a modern life, right? So they're very inward focused. Very often the entrances also are away from the street. They're like in little courtyards, interiors, and they really sort of turn their back on the city, and that's intentional. Now, the other thing, because it came partly out of the settlement house movement, there was this emphasis on community planning, but a pretty narrow vision of what community entailed, right? So community life now, it was going to take place in a community center, right? Not in a bar, you know, not in a religious institution or things like that. It was in this sort of a settlement house in a public housing development. And that's the reason why NYCHA today has so many, over 100 community centers on site. And that's sort of their vision of what the good city would be. Now, we get back to Moses again, who is also a major player here. He's not really a big player in the 30s, but by the 1940s, he gets behind, actually in the late 30s, he gets behind public housing because he wants to change the city also, right? And he wants to knock down neighborhoods, he wants to build highways, he wants to build middle-income housing. He has a lot of things he wants to knock down. So he basically needed public housing, even though he didn't like the idea of it that much. And so he pushes public housing both particularly in Albany, in the city as well. He doesn't run the housing authority, but he does pick the people who run it in the post-war period. And what's really interesting about sort of New York, and what also makes New York have so much public housing, so today we still have about 178,000 units of public housing, which there's really no comparison in the United States at all to this. But the reason we have so much of it is there was a federal program, a new federal program that began in 1949, but beginning in the 30s and then expanded in the 1940s and 50s were state-funded and city-funded public housing developments. Right? So that made New York's program much larger than other cities, because we didn't just have to depend on the federal government, which was never really that comfortable with public housing. New York really wanted it. And I would just point out the middle one there, city-funded housing developments. These were actually almost competitive at some level with the middle-income developments, which, just to come back, Carol, to this wonderful exhibition here, basically our public housing authority got into the middle-income housing business, right? And a lot of people didn't like that, so they were forced out of it. But they weren't bad at it, actually, and they built about 30,000 when they were done, city-funded public housing developments, which were built at standards which were higher than both the state and federal projects. And they tend to be some of the developments which are still some of the most popular in the city, like Ravenswood houses and so forth, built to definitely higher standards. You'll notice that the map here basically shows the kind of concentration of developments in the city, former tenement districts, by and large. The scale of them, you can't really see it here, but there are many, many, many developments. 69 projects, over 1,000 units each. And just to give you a little sense, I heard about the East New York rezoning. One of the numbers I heard was it will add 960 affordable units in that neighborhood. There are 69 NYCHA projects with over 1,000 units, just up till about 1965. All right, so you just get a sense of the scale of how much housing they're building in this period. And of course, it transformed neighborhoods, right? Between all the programs Matt was talking about that were kind of these public-private partnerships, right, for middle income, and then public housing, places like East Harlem were really transformed into very different kinds of environments, right? Taft houses is in East Harlem, for instance. And you had many of these housing projects in the post-war period. They got taller in this period. The open space actually got more extreme, to where in many of the developments it was 80% open space and only 20% taken up by the building site. Of course, height was driven by cost concerns, but there also was an international movement. The same developments that Matt is talking about, they're high-rises for medium, or high-rises for the middle class. This was also thought the best way to do housing for many different kinds of people. Now, what sort of distinguishes New York is, of course, the longevity of this housing, which is both a blessing in many ways, but it's also a concern today. Because cities like Chicago, which you see here, have in some ways resolved their public housing issues, or they had problems going back into the 1960s. And their solution to places like Robert Taylor Homes was to basically knock them down. Right? Whereas New York has maintained these developments, and as I'll talk about, is spending billions of dollars to basically try to keep them habitable over time. So the question is, and I'll go quickly through this, but why, how is New York, what are sort of the strategies New York has been using and still is to basically maintain public housing? Some of them really are just more context than strategies. We can talk about density, diversity, and transit. Well, why does public housing succeed in New York? Well, density of population, the market pressure, it keeps public housing in spite of the fact that popular, in spite of the fact that public housing had a lot of the similar issues that public housing had in other cities. So you had basically, by the late 60s, certainly 1970s and 80s, a concentration of poverty in many developments, but not all. You have increasing crime, other issues. But when you look at a city like St. Louis, where Pruitt-Igoe, you mentioned the disastrous public housing project was, you can see that loss of population basically also of the city as a whole, population, that's part of your market. The public housing was built to serve, and I strongly recommend the Pruitt-Igoe myth if you haven't seen it, because I think they do a very good job on this topic. But look at New York. We basically have maintained our population. We did lose 1 million people or so in the 70s, right? But we've rebounded. So these are all people who need housing. So every apartment in New York is valuable. And I think that, that's an important factor in how the Housing Authority has maintained its tenancy, and I would also argue why people fight for this housing. It's also from basically an ethnic or racial dimension. Public housing in New York has always been more complex than a lot of other cities. In many American cities, it either was first segregated, and then it was almost entirely African American, and very often a white majority city sometimes, and very isolated. But as you can see here, there's a variety of different ethnic groups which have occupied public housing for quite a while. And even today, when we use terms like African American or Hispanic to describe the population of public housing in New York, that's not really very descriptive, right? I mean, it's really going global in a sense. This housing is global, and I think that helps maintain the political sort of will to sort of maintain this housing over time, because politicians basically serve over 400,000 people who live in it, and it's a pretty wide range of people who do live in it. It's also pretty well located. There are developments which are very isolated in the city, like in Staten Island or places like that. But by and large, if you know public housing, you'll know that a lot of it is connected very nicely to subway lines and things like that. So that makes it that adds an attractive dimension to a lot of public housing in the city. I don't have a lot of time to talk about different management choices. I've written a lot about it. But we can talk about tenant selection. The Housing Authority has always been rather controversial since the 1930s in its tenant choices. Very often favoring the working poor, maybe even the working class, sometimes even the middle class with its city projects, which have helped maintain its financial base, has also kept families on site who have income levels which a lot of people think are too high for public housing, but people have stayed in these developments, and that has helped basically the financial picture of public housing, helped to maintain it over time to collect rents and so forth. Also, a relatively small number compared to, let's say, St. Louis or Chicago, of very big apartments. A lot of smaller apartments, not a lot of big families, and a better sort of ratio of young people to old people, as you say. There's been consistent investment over time. These are some recent maps which the Housing Authority did, some GIS maps, basically showing various investments and so forth. And as I mentioned, I think in the next couple of years, between the Sandy money and other investments, it'll be about $5 billion in capital spending for a broke housing authority, as people like to say all the time. But that's a lot of money, and so the Housing Authority has been very good at figuring out how to get extra state subsidies, but particularly, I should say, federal subsidies, because state subsidies are really hard to get, but certainly extra federal subsidies and so forth over time, and those have been key to basically maintaining this housing. I think that in general, just to come back around to sort of satisfaction and things like that, people have a lot of individual complaints about service or things like that, but residents do. But in a recent survey, I mean, people basically value their apartments, they're decent size, they're in decent locations. When maintained properly, they're quite valuable, and you kind of, if you want to sort of think about the value of them, these are apartments that rent at an average of about $500 a month, and that is an asset for a family in New York. If you think about all the money you're not having to spend on rent, where can that money go? And so I think that is a key. They have a very, NYCHA, even though you'll hear a story here and there, but a very low eviction rate, basically works with social service agencies to keep people on site, all right? And so even still has housing assistants who basically go out and collect the rent, which is not to say there are not major issues. Most of the developments are quite old. There is a need for approximately maybe $17 billion in capital funding over the next few years. There's no clear source of that funding, neither from rents or federal subsidies, and so forth. But I wanted to end on this slide, which was from the Sandy. Some of this was buried a little bit, but I like to sort of show it, which was one of the proposals for rebuilding Red Hook houses after Sandy. There's not the money to do all this, but a reskinning of the development. And I think only in a place like New York where people really want to talk about kind of renewing public housing in this way, that you could actually really not change it that much. It's still the same towers and sort of these developments, but that you would make it a more livable place by, for instance, moving the elevators to the exterior of the building. There's some very interesting ideas, make them better sealed, make them a more attractive environment. So on that, Matt, you wanted to finish up?
Sure. So now that Nick has talked about public housing, I'm going to spend the next few minutes, the last few minutes, of our time talking about the contemporary system of what today we call affordable housing. And I always like to put affordable in quotation marks when I write it or say it. And this is the system that began to emerge incrementally in the 1970s and 1980s in the ashes of the older public and middle income housing programs. As early as the late 1950s, and then especially in the 60s and 70s under Mayor Lindsay and Governor Rockefeller, there was an effort to begin to move away from the large-scale clearance favored by Robert Moses and to work more closely with communities to plan housing that better suited their needs. And one of the earliest experiments in this direction that we feature in the book is a project called the Westside Urban Renewal Area, which, unlike most Robert Moses era slum clearance projects, engaged in what was called spot clearance. It used money for rehabilitation rather than just demolition and new construction. It included housing for a mixture of income groups, including middle income, low income public housing, sometimes, and this was pretty radical for the time, even in the same buildings. Sort of foreshadowing 80-20 programs and MIH and other programs that wouldn't come up for decades later. And the project was it was just innovative in all sorts of ways. Here we see some of the row houses that NYCHA renovated that became public housing. So when we think about public housing, it's not all red brick high rises. There are a whole variety of different shapes and sizes in New York. Then in the 1960s, the state set up the Urban Development Corporation, which in partnership with a variety of architects, including several avant-garde architects like Kenneth Frampton, developed a series of smaller scale complexes like Marcus Garvey Village in Brooklyn and Twin Parks in the Bronx. UDC also built Roosevelt Island, a mixed income new town in the city, which featured Surt's Eastwood. Then the city and state and federal government, everyone ran out of money for large-scale housing construction. Nixon canceled public housing, canceled urban renewal, leaving the city really to fend for itself in a rather disastrous economic climate, but one in which still demanded housing subsidies. We did lose lose residents, as Nick mentioned, in the 1970s, but never as many as were lost in other cities in the US. In this era, thousands of apartments a year were being abandoned, and sometimes tens of thousands. And that was true of every older, aging industrial city in the US. But New York handled things a bit differently than other cities did. At first, the city really responded on a kind of emergency basis, condemning some buildings, resulting in a lot of fallow brownfield sites. But other times the city began to bring in emergency services. Here we see a mobile heat unit from the early 1970s. The city would bring in coal to pipe in hot water to sustain residents while they sort of figured out longer-term solutions. Gradually, the city began to work with tenants, recruiting them to manage buildings. And then in 1973, a group of city employees they left the city and formed a nonprofit called UHAB, the Urban Homestead Assistance Board. And with their help, tenants began to buy their buildings from the city, at least buildings that had ended up in city ownership in lieu of payment of, or rather, when they didn't pay their property taxes. By the 1980s, the so-called homesteading movement had become official city policy, and the city tasked its housing agency, not NYCHA, but the reconfigured Housing Preservation and Development Department, with transferring properties to tenants. The 1980s also saw the emergence of a new category of below-market builder, the Community Development Corporation, or CDC. CDCs had first emerged in the 1960s, mainly doing community economic development, taking advantage of a whole series of Great Society programs under LBJ. But in the early 1980s, a few of those that survived and some new ones came along and began to focus on housing. One of the first and most successful of these CDCs in housing was the Nehemiah Housing Corporation, which was set up by a group of pastors in East Brooklyn congregations, working in partnership with the Industrial Areas Foundation and with a retired suburban developer. And in 1983, they began to develop the first of 4 large-scale complexes of sort of serial production row houses that took the kind of mass-built Levittown model and applied it to urban space. And a lot of it was done on city-owned land that had been cleared by the city for urban redevelopment back in the 60s or early 70s, which there was no longer money to see through. Increasingly, the city came to understand CDCs as crucial partners, and their capacity to build, along with the capacity of tenants to manage properties, became the cornerstone for the city's first major post-welfare state housing plan. And this was Ed Koch's Tenure initiative, announced in 1986. And this plan recognized the realities of limited federal and state support for below-market housing and proposed instead a series of benchmarks for preservation and production that the city would help meet through employment of a sort of layered mixture of smaller scale subsidies directed to developers and nonprofits. And the effort was aided by a series of new national nonprofits that were set up by large philanthropists, like the Rockefeller Foundation, which in the wake of public housing began to take a new interest in below-market development. And one of these groups, called Enterprise Community Partners, that had been set up in the early 80s by a Baltimore shopping center developer named James Rouse, fought in Congress for a whole new set of very quiet sort of backdoor subsidies in the form of tax credits, federal tax credits for low-income housing production, which Congress introduced in 1986, and which quietly since then has helped develop more units than were ever built under the federal public housing program, about 2.6 million units since 1986. Architecturally, the housing built under this new, what we call a decentralized system of affordable housing, was more modest in scale than the public and middle-income housing projects of the mid-20th century. And there's been, in New York City, a lot less of it. The thing about all these new programs is they tend to be distributed on a per capita basis, whereas the older programs worked sort of like grant programs, so tended to be distributed more on the basis of need. So a big city like New York that really had a lot of need for subsidies could apply and get the lion's share of them. And certainly we're a large city, so we get many of these subsidies on a per capita plan, but not as much as we need. So much of this housing has been, it's smaller in scale than the older projects, but a lot of it has been very high in quality. And certainly we've gained in quality and in sensitivity to context and input from residents what we've lost in volume. And we see this citywide in neighborhoods like East New York and Brownsville that have been totally transformed by investment by CDCs using these various smaller scale programs. One of the most dramatic turnarounds under this decentralized system that emerged beginning in the 70s and 80s has been in the Melrose section of the South Bronx. Here we see kind of before picture of Melrose in the 1990s with a lot of fallow land, a lot of empty lots, some public housing and other public-private housing done in the 60s and 70s in the background. In the mid-1990s, the city wanted to designate this area as an urban renewal zone and proposed essentially to fill in a lot of the empty space with these kinds of row houses that CDCs had been successfully building in parts of Brooklyn and also parts of the South Bronx. A community group here formed called Nos Quedamos, or We Stay, and it objected to this idea. What they wanted to fight for was for not just rebuilding, but really a restoration of the neighborhood at higher densities than the row house model allowed. And when they protested to the city agreed to empower them to develop a new plan and paid for the services of a private consulting firm, Magnuson Architecture and Planning, to help them devise an alternate plan. And since then, and the plan was adopted, and since then, Magnuson, along with Nos Quedamos and a whole series of private partners, have developed thousands of units, fundamentally transforming this whole section of the city. Unfortunately, the big catch with this new model of public-private provision is that there has never been enough money for construction to meet demand, especially as the city's population has rebounded. Decline has reversed, and now we're at an all-time high after these many decades of decline. As early as the Koch administration, here we see Mayor Koch, the city's Department of Housing Preservation and Development, which tended to manage tenancy of all of these various projects, was receiving hundreds of applications for every new unit built. Here, the older photos are more dramatic than the new photos. Today we do these lotteries online, so there's nothing to see. But when you had to send in a letter or a postcard and piles of mail were building up, we can really sort of see quite visually how much competition, how much demand there was for these below market subsidized units. And here we see, here we see the applications coming in, and here we see Koch in a publicity stunt picking names out of a hopper to see who's going to get units. Back then it was hundreds of applications for every unit. Today, in a lot of the recent lotteries, we're seeing 1,000 applications per unit. In some lotteries, 1,500 applications per unit. Meanwhile, as in the early middle income programs and the programs before that, the philanthropic programs, many of the units are too expensive for families in need. The subsidies that we've made available to developers are too shallow to bridge the gap between the cost of construction and the rents that people are able to pay. This gap has led our mayors, Bloomberg and now de Blasio, and mayors in other cities as well, to shift some of the responsibility for subsidies onto developers by asking them to build and operate below market units in return for density bonuses, or in effect, the promise of more profits from building additional market rate units. And while I'm optimistic that de Blasio will reach his goal of 8,000 new units a year for 10 years using these models, I think it's clear that to truly address the housing gap, there's no substitute for deep public subsidies. The question I leave you with is whether we have the political will to pay for those subsidies, like Singapore does. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Nick and I are happy to take questions.
To go and vote, go ahead.
Oh, if you need, right, if you need to vote or
The others just shout out the question.
come on, you want to come up or should I sit down? And you were extremely patient. I was very proud of you.
You can sign before you go. Yes. So you've got a sheet.
Thank you guys for coming out. I actually used to live a few miles from Pruitt-Igoe, the site.
Oh,
Big time. Heard legends of it as a kid.
we can do the questions informally, yeah.
The students, there's some reception as well. So.
Oh yeah, we can go over to the reception and unless somebody has questions they'd like us to answer for everyone.